Welcome to our deep dive. This time, we're tackling Western philosophy.
Big topic.
Yeah, but we've got a great guide, a history of Western philosophy.
Excellent choice.
And we're not going to just recite the book, we're going to have a real conversation. Pull out the good stuff, the surprises.
Those hidden gems that make you go, whoa, I never knew that.
Exactly. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Okay, so the book starts off strong, talking about this big shift with Descartes, the dawn of modern thought, all that.
Descartes is key, yeah. He's like the turning point.
I'm picturing those old medieval paintings, everyone looking UP, all heavenly focused.
Right, outward focused, looking to authority, tradition. Descartes comes along and he's all, hold on, what about the I?
The I think, therefore I am guy. Suddenly it's all about me, myself, and I.
He opened the door to that, for sure.
Yeah.
Emphasize the individual self, the power of our own thinking.
Subjectivity.
Exactly. And that gets picked up by Berkeley, Kant. They're wrestling with how much our minds shape what we perceive.
Reality is just what I make it, man. Did it get that extreme?
Pretty close. The book calls it extreme subjectivism. Fichte, for example.
Whoa, reality is just my mind projecting outward.
Philosophy's about to implode at this point, right?
Huh? Not quite. There's a swing back, like the universe course correcting. A return to common sense. Gotta ground things somehow.
Okay, so we've got this back and forth, outward focus, inward focus. But here's where things get really interesting. The book links this to a political shift and brings up the Anabaptists.
Anabaptists. Most folks just think of their religious stuff.
Yeah, I was surprised too.
They were radical politically, rejecting all laws. Like, a truly good person doesn't need laws, they're guided internally.
Wait, no laws at all. That's anarchy, right?
Pure anarchy. Individual freedom above all else. Makes you think, could that even work?
Where's the line between freedom and chaos? Big question.
Huge. And they tried it out too in Munster. Things got interesting, to say the least.
The book just hints at it. I'm dying to know the details. Communal living, free love. They push the boundaries, that's for sure.
A real-life social experiment.
And it didn't end well. They were violently suppressed.
But their ideas didn't just disappear, did they?
Nope. That core belief, individual freedom, it kept bubbling up. Quakers, then modern anarchist thought.
It's like once that genie's out of the bottle.
You can't stuff it back in. Ideas have a life of their own.
Okay, so pendulum swings, seeds of anarchy. But rewind a bit, we've been all logic, reason. The book reminds us, ancient Greece, it wasn't all just rationality.
Right, there was this whole mystical side too, like an underground current.
Oh, tell me more.
The Orphics. Secret society, rituals obsessed with the afterlife, total contrast to all the logic chopping.
I'm picturing robes, torches, chanting.
And these tablets they found in tombs, the Orphic tablets.
Guidebooks for the dead. Spooky.
Instructions for the soul's journey, cryptic messages from beyond the grave.
Gives me chills. What kind of stuff did they say?
Fragmentary, but powerful. This one line from the Petilia tablet fulfilled his red and bleeding feasts. Just listen to the language.
Whoa, definitely not your average philosophy lecture.
Held the great mother's mountain flame, poetic almost.
And this influenced later thinkers, like Socrates.
The connections are there. Even in ancient Greece, it wasn't just one way of thinking. It's more complex than that.
Layers upon layers. Speaking of ancient Greece, we all know Pythagoras, the triangle guy.
Right, but he's more than just a theorem.
The book paints a much more intriguing picture.
Pythagoras, he was fleeing a tyrant. Polycrates, ruler of Samos.
So a political refugee. Makes sense, tyrants, not known for their love of dissent.
And Samos was doing pretty well too under Polycrates. Public works, they had an Acreon, the famous poet, luxury, culture.
But Pythagoras, he's out of there. What did he see that we're missing?
Hard to say. Some think he went to Egypt, soaking up ancient wisdom.
Mystery.
Ends up in Croton, a powerful city in southern Italy.
Croton. Now that rings a bell. Wasn't that near Sybaris?
Oh, you know your ancient history. Sybaris, the city so decadent, it gave us the word Sybarite.
Exactly. So Croton and Sybaris, neighbors.
More like rivals. Sybaris, huge trading center, 300,000 people.
Wow, that's a big city, even by today's standards.
And Croton wiped them out, completely destroyed Sybaris.
Talk about a power move. What did Pythagoras think of all this?
We can only imagine. But it adds a whole new layer to his story, Ro.
It does. He witnesses the rise and fall of empires, chooses to settle in this powerful, militaristic city.
In Croton, they were famous for medicine, too. This doctor, Democedes, he ends up treating both Polycrates, the tyrant Pythagoras fled, and later King Darius of Persia.
Talk about a tangled web. Okay, enough politics for now. Let's get back to those big ideas. Heraclitus, this guy saw the universe in a whole different light.
Heraclitus, now he's fascinating. Not so much the scientific observer type. He was a mystic.
Mysticism, we're back to that again.
But his mysticism, it wasn't about escaping the world. It was about embracing change, constant flux, everything in motion.
Sounds a bit stressful. Did he believe in anything lasting?
Fire. Fire was the fundamental element for him, always transforming, creating, destroying.
You can't step in the same river twice. Didn't he say that?
That was him. And this great line, mortals are immortals, and immortals are mortals.
Deep.
Living the other's death, dying the other's life. Even life and death, part of the endless dance.
Makes you think about the cycles of nature.
Right. And behind it all, there's unity. All things come out of the one, and the one out of all things.
I'm getting a yin-yang vibe here.
There's definitely a sense of balance in his philosophy.
Okay, so change is the only constant. But then you've got those who believe in a static, unchanging reality. Who are those guys?
Parmenides, for example. He was all about unchanging being, eternal, unmoving, absolute.
But how can that be? The world's obviously in constant flux.
His argument was based on language. Words have fixed meanings, right? So what they describe must also be unchanging.
But words change meaning all the time. Like cool didn't always mean cool, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The book uses George Washington. What that name means to someone who knew him back then versus U.S. now.
Totally different.
Even for us, George Washington isn't the man himself, but something in our minds, N now W.
So language itself can be slippery.
Very much so. And that undermines Parmenides' whole argument. Even seemingly fixed meanings are subject to change and interpretation.
Okay, enough word games. This Empedocles guy, the book makes him sound like a real character. What's his deal?
Empedocles. Think Renaissance man, but centuries early. Scientist, philosopher, politician.
A triple threat.
And get this, he claimed to be a god.
Whoa, hold on. Was this like a metaphor, or did he really believe it?
Well, exile was common in Greek politics. Lose a power struggle, you flee or die. He was this democratic leader in Sicily, and bam, declares himself divine. Makes you wonder, does exile warp your perspective?
Maybe a bit of both. A little power trip, a little cosmic insight.
Hard to say. But he was clearly a larger-than-life figure.
Okay, moving on. The atomists, these guys sound like they were way ahead of their time.
Democritus and Leucippus. They came up with this idea everything's made of tiny, indivisible particles, atoms, moving around in empty space, the void.
Mind-blowing. They figured that out back then.
Centuries before modern science.
Mm-hmm.
And this void thing, it's fascinating how our understanding of nothingness has evolved.
Maybe the rundown.
So they thought it was literally nothing. Then Newton, he saw space as a substance. Descartes, an attribute of bodies.
Okay, getting abstract.
Then Leibniz, space is a system of relations. But then Einstein, distances between events involving time, too.
My brain hurts. So much for simple emptiness.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. And modern physics, no action at a distance.
What does it even mean? Things can affect each other without touching.
Hard to explain without getting into the math, but it suggests everything's connected, influencing each other in ways we barely grasp.
Whoa, okay, I need a moment to process all that, but let's bring it back down to earth for a bit. The book talks about a kind of decline after all these pre-Socratic guys. Not a crash, but a shift.
The Pre-Socratics, they were interested in everything. The cosmos, nature, how things work.
Universal thinkers.
But afterward, the focus narrows. More about humans, ethics, skepticism.
The big questions start to feel smaller.
In a way, yeah. More inward-looking. And that leads us to Socrates and Plato.
Socrates, the know-nothing guy, always asking questions.
The OG gadfly. But before we get to his ideas, we got to talk about his trial.
Yes, the trial. Sentenced to death for... Well, what exactly?
Impiety, corrupting the youth. It's all a bit vague. Athens was in a bad spot, just lost a war.
Paranoid, looking for scapegoats.
Exactly. Socrates, with his questioning, he'd ruffled some feathers. Powerful enemies.
So was he truly guilty or just in the wrong place at the wrong time?
It's the question everyone asks. But regardless, his defense, as Plato tells it, it's brilliant.
I'm picturing him standing there defiant.
And he basically says, you can't harm me. Only I can harm myself by acting unjustly.
Virtue is its own reward. Very stoic.
Totally. And his lifestyle, simple, barefoot. Echoes of cynicism there, too.
Not materialistic at all. Didn't care for physical speculations, the book says.
He was all about human behavior, seeking the good life. And that's reflected in those early Platonic dialogues, defining things like temperance, friendship, courage.
Laying the groundwork for a whole new way of doing philosophy. But before we dive into Plato, let's jump ahead a few centuries. Plutarch, not a philosopher.
More of a biographer, historian, lived during the Roman Empire.
So why is he in our philosophy deep dive?
Because he shaped how we see the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
His biographies, they're vivid, full of stories, moral lessons.
You made them come alive.
Exactly. And he had this great quote, "What matters are the memories retained by mankind."
So he saw himself as a preserver of memory.
Like a curator, saving those shining moments from the past. Plato, Aristotle, they become almost mythical figures through his lens.
And he was hugely influential later on. Renaissance thinkers loved him. The U.S. founding fathers, too.
He helped shape their understanding of democracy, individual liberty, all that.
Pretty powerful stuff for a biographer. But let's narrow our focus. Plutarch's account of Sparta. Fascinating, but kind of disturbing, too, right?
Sparta, the ultimate law and order society. Everything geared towards military strength.
Individual freedom. Not so much.
Nope. You existed to serve the state, from birth to death.
And those Spartan boys, the training was brutal.
Ritual floggings. Supposed to build courage, but ouch.
Makes you appreciate our modern, gentler approach to education.
And homosexuality, it was actually encouraged in Sparta.
Really? That's not what I expected. Why was that?
It was seen as part of a boy's education, building bonds between warriors, different times, different values.
It's a good reminder that normal is relative, even within the same civilization. But getting back to that discipline, the book quote the Plutarch, they were not born to serve themselves, but their country.
Chilling, isn't it? Makes you wonder if any system can justify that level of control.
Big questions. Okay, let's talk Plato now, his famous Republic. Is this a blueprint for utopia?
Not exactly. It's more like a thought experiment, exploring justice, its role in the individual and the state.
So, a philosophical playground. Testing out ideas.
Exactly. His main point. Justice means everyone doing their proper job, contributing to the common good. Simple, right?
Sounds good in theory. But who decides what my proper job is?
He uses this analogy, a football team. You wouldn't pick players randomly. You want the best for each position.
Makes sense. So it's about putting the right people in the right roles.
Based on their natural abilities.
Yeah.
A kind of meritocracy.
Okay, I can get behind that. But who decides what merit even means?
Ah, good point. And there's another problem. Plato, he assumes a static society. Roles are fixed, no change. What about jobs we consider harmful, even if someone's good at them?
Like a really efficient tyrant. Plato's system doesn't seem to have an answer for that.
Nope. And it all hinges on this idea of an objective good. Who decides that? Plato doesn't really say.
Big questions, yet again. But before we tackle those, the theory of forms. The book tries to explain it with Cat, but my brain still hurts.
It's a tough one. So Plato, he says there's this perfect, ideal cat created by God outside our world.
The ultimate cat, the cat to rule all cats.
Exactly. And every cat you see is just an imperfect copy of that perfect cat, like a reflection in a mirror.
So my cat's just a shadow of the true cat.
Kinda, yeah. And it applies to everything. He talks about the perfect bed made by God.
God's a furniture maker now. Interesting career choice.
The point is, the philosopher, they're not interested in these mundane, earthly things. They seek the ideal, the perfect form.
Sounds a bit like escaping reality, honestly.
There's definitely a disdain for the material world. It echoes Socrates and his no physical speculations thing.
Both focused on the realm of pure thought. Okay, back to Socrates. He's sentenced to death, could have escaped, but chooses to stay. Why?
Profound act of principle. He felt obligated to obey the law, even if unjust. And there's this divine voice guiding him towards his fate.
The book describes it as a flute in the ears of the mystic.
Haunting, right. And in the Phaedo, his last hours, he's calmly discussing death with friends, even sends his weeping wife away.
Dedicated to philosophy to the very end. The book mentions he compares humans to prisoners who can't just escape. That's an Orphic idea, right?
It is. And his belief in wise gods, a better existence for good souls, it foreshadows Christianity in a way.
Another fascinating connection. Okay, philosophy, religion, it's all intertwined. But let's tackle a big problem Plato grappled with. How do we reconcile knowledge with this idea of constant change?
Right, he was influenced by Heraclitus, the flux guy. But true knowledge, it has to be about something stable. If everything's always changing, what can we truly know?
It's like trying to grab hold of water. It slips right through your fingers.
In the Theaetetus, Plato uses these simple examples, like the number 6. It's big compared to 1, but small compared to 100.
So it's all relative.
Exactly. Even Socrates, tall or short, depends who he's next to.
Makes sense, but doesn't that make knowledge impossible?
That's the challenge. And the book points out this problem of relational propositions. It stumped even great minds like Hegel.
So are we doomed to never truly know anything?
The modern view, it sees knowledge as evolving, but needing some grounding, even if that ground shifts over time.
So it's a constant process, always refining our understanding. Exciting, but kind of scary, too.
Okay, for now, Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. What do you mean by that?
He's saying each person's perception is their reality. We experience the world uniquely. There's no objective standard outside that.
So we're all living in our own little subjective bubbles.
Kinda, yeah. It raises all sorts of questions about communication, how we agree on anything. If it's all subjective, what about truth?
Deep stuff. Okay, now for the big guy, Aristotle. Student of Plato, but he went his own way, right?
Aristotle, he was more grounded, less idealistic, big on substances, each with form and matter.
Okay, give me an example.
A wooden chair. The wood itself, that's the matter. The shape the carpenter gives it, the design, that's the form. Makes sense. So it's not just random wood. It's got a purpose, a shape that makes it a chair.
Exactly. And for Aristotle, this applied to everything, not just physical stuff. Even ideas have a form that gives them essence.
So what about us, humans? Do we have a form?
Big question. Are we shaped by something inherent, or are we just a collection of experiences?
Now we're getting existential. But for now, Aristotle's God. Was he a religious dude?
He believed in God, but not like the personal God of Christianity, his God, the first cause, the unmoved mover.
So he sets things in motion, but doesn't really get involved.
More like a philosophical principle, pure thought, causing motion just by being loved.
A very hands-off approach to divinity. The book quotes Aristotle, "God is a living being, eternal, most good."
Yeah. Okay, enough about the divine. Back to us humans, ethics and politics. What did Aristotle have to say about those?
He was all about the good life, just like Plato. But he also dug into social good, its connection to the individual. Like, is the good of the community just the sum of individual goods or something more? It's like, is a cake just a bunch of ingredients? Or is it the combination, the baking, that makes it something special?
Perfect analogy.
Mm-hmm.
He used the human body. Pleasures, they belong to the whole person, not just the individual organ.
Interesting. So the state, it's more than just the sum of its citizens.
It has its own properties, goals, according to Aristotle.
Did he believe in equality for all citizens then?
Here's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
Aristotle, for all his brilliance, he held some views we wouldn't agree with today.
Oh, what?
He was okay with slavery, thought women were inferior, and even among citizens, he opposed political equality.
Whoa, that's pretty harsh. How did he justify that?
He thought extremes of wealth and poverty were corrupting. Best rulers, those with moderate wealth, favored rule by a virtuous elite.
So a kind of aristocracy.
He liked monarchy, aristocracy, constitutional rule,
Mm-hmm.
but stressed it's the character of the rulers that matters.
So not just the system, but the people running it. Timeless wisdom there. Speaking of timeless, Aristotle's logic, that's his big contribution, right?
He's the father of formal logic, developed this whole system of reasoning based on syllogisms.
Syllogisms. Sounds familiar, but I'm a little rusty.
Those three-part arguments. You deduce conclusions from premises, like all humans are mortal. Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal.
I remember now. It's like a logic puzzle.
Exactly. Aristotle believed using this, we could avoid errors in thinking. And even though modern logic's more complex, his principles are still key for critical thinking.
So logic, it's a tool for clear thinking. Speaking of analysis, the book takes a look at Aristotle's substance idea. What's the issue there?
We tend to think of things as solid, unchanging. Socrates as if he was just one thing his whole life. But the book says Socrates, it's just a label for a bunch of events, experiences.
Like a river, it's always flowing, changing.
Right. No unchanging river substance, just the process. And this ties into modern physics. Everything, even solid stuff, is ultimately a process, not a static thing.
It makes you question what existence even means. Deep stuff. Okay, on to firmer ground, Euclid. Geometry, nice and solid, right?
Euclid's Elements, it was the geometry textbook for centuries. And the amazing thing, it's not all original. He organized existing knowledge brilliantly.
So a master compiler.
You could say that,
Yeah.
but his rigor, that's what stands out. Proofs, theorems, all laid out logically. And he's honest about his assumptions. Like with parallels, that famous postulate.
He knew it wasn't as solid as some other stuff.
He was aware of the limitations. And his treatment of irrational numbers, very clever.
Those pesky irrationals.
His theory of proportion, he sidestepped the problem. And guess what? Similar methods used by 19th century mathematicians.
Ahead of his time. Okay, let's look to the stars now. We talked about that shift away from the Earth-centered view. That had to be a huge change in thinking.
Monumental. For centuries, we're the center of everything, sun and stars dancing around us.
It's intuitive, right? Look up. Seems like everything's revolving around us.
Totally. But cracks start appearing. In Opides, he discovers the obliquity of the ecliptic.
The obliquity of what now?
The sun's path across the sky, it's tilted. Not as simple as they thought.
The universe getting a little more complicated.
And the sun, they realized it was way bigger than Earth, made it less likely we were the center.
Makes sense.
Then there's Heraclides of Pontus, Aristotle's time. He's got two huge EE ideas.
Okay, hit me.
First, Venus and Mercury, they revolve around the sun, not Earth. Second, the Earth itself rotates every 24 hours.
Whoa, revolutionary. Why isn't he more famous?
Well, apparently he was known as a fat dandy, so.
Haha, even back then, image matters.
But his ideas, they planted the seeds for Copernicus later on.
Speaking of which, the book makes the surprising link between the spread of Greek thought and Alexander the Great.
Right. Not a philosopher himself, but his conquests.
Ended up preserving all that Greek stuff.
Ironically, yeah. His empire, then the Roman one, provided stability, infrastructure.
Without them, all those scrolls, those ideas could have been lost.
Exactly. The stability introduced by Western conquerors is what saved it. Kind of a twisted irony there.
It makes you think about all the knowledge that's been lost throughout history because of war, destruction.
We only have a fraction of the story.
Okay, on a more hopeful note, the so-called Dark Ages. Turns out the Arabs were pretty busy during that time.
While Europe's stumbling around, Arab scholars are flourishing, translating Greek texts, writing commentaries, making their own discoveries.
They kept the torch of knowledge burning.
Exactly. And it's through them that Europe rediscovers Aristotle in the 11th century.
Wow. So much of what we consider Western thought.
It has roots elsewhere.
It's a good reminder that knowledge transcends borders, cultures.
It's a human story constantly evolving. It's a human story constantly evolving.
Okay, let's talk about Plotinus now. This guy lived during the decline of the Roman Empire, 3rd century AD. The book says he founded Neoplatonism. What was that all about?
It was a revival of Plato's ideas, but with this mystical twist. Plotinus, he offered an escape from all the chaos, the suffering of the material world. Turn inward, contemplate the good, the beautiful.
A philosophy for troubled times. When the world's falling apart, people seek solace.
Makes sense, right? And Plotinus, he appealed to both pagans and early Christians.
Really? Both sides.
His concept of the logos, the divine word reason, influenced Christian theology big time.
So bridging the gap between those two worldviews, the book describes Plotinus' system as a kind of trinity, but not the Christian one. What's that all about?
It's a hierarchy, 3 levels. First, the one, ultimate source of everything, totally beyond our grasp.
Okay, sounds pretty abstract so far.
Then there's Nous, the divine intellect. This emanates from the one, contains the forms, all that.
So like a step down.
Right. And then Soul. This is the lowest level. It creates the material world, but at T, it still has those blessed spirits within it.
Okay, so it's like a ladder, climbing up from the material to the spiritual. Did Plotinus see the material world as, like, evil? Something to be escaped?
Not exactly. Less perfect than the intellectual realm, a reflection but a flawed one. He actually criticized the Gnostics. Yeah, they thought the material world was evil. Plotinus, he saw it as more like a flawed masterpiece. Still beauty there, a stark of the divine.
Okay, that makes more sense, like appreciating a handmade object, even with its imperfections. Okay, enough ancient philosophy for now. Let's talk about the rise of Christianity. Huge topic, of course, but what are the key takeaways from the book?
It emphasizes Christianity as it develops. It's not just one thing, it's a fusion. Greek philosophy, Jewish morals, and history.
A melting pot of ideas.
Exactly. And even hints of those mystery religions like Orphism that we talked about earlier.
So it's not just this clean break from the past, it's building on what came before. Give me some examples how those threads come together.
Sure. Monotheism. Belief in one God. Radical idea back then comes straight from Judaism.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
A linear view of history.
Yes.
Moving towards a goal, God's involved. That's Jewish too.
Interesting. So it's not just cyclical, like some other cultures believed.
All right, it's got direction, purpose. And then this idea of the chosen people. Even when they're conquered, they still believe they're special.
That definitely feeds into Christianity's sense of its own mission, destiny. Okay, what about the Old Testament prophets? Are they just fortune tellers predicting the future?
The book challenges that. It argues they were often like radicals, challenging the status quo, calling for social justice.
So not just upholding tradition, but trying to change it.
Exactly. Sometimes even criticizing the powerful, the privileged.
Sounds risky.
It was. And the book makes this point. Every generation reinterprets history to fit their needs. Right?
Oh, totally. We see that all the time. Let's talk about the Septuagint now. That Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Why was that so important?
It made the scriptures accessible to a much wider audience. Folks who didn't speak Hebrew could finally engage with those texts.
Opened up a whole new world. But the book mentions this legend about its creation.
Yes. 70 translators working independently, and they all produce identical versions.
Miraculous.
Proof of divine inspiration, right? But later scholarship showed, well, it wasn't perfect. There were errors, inconsistencies.
The legend was too good to be true.
Sadly, yes. But people believed it for centuries. And it's fascinating. The Jews, they abandoned the Septuagint after Christianity takes off.
But the early Christians, they kept using it.
They did. So this flawed translation, it actually played a key role in shaping Christian understanding of the Old Testament.
History's full of ironies like that. What about Jerome's Vulgate? That was the Latin translation, right? The official one for the Catholic Church.
It was, but not right away. Some Christians, they were suspicious at first.
Why?
Jerome, he consulted with Jewish scholars. And some Christians thought, oh no, maybe he's putting in those foreign interpretations.
Always those internal debates, even within the same religion. Okay, this Origen guy, the book makes him sound like a real wild card.
Origen, a 3rd century theologian, very influenced by Greek philosophy, especially Plato, tried to reconcile those ideas with Christian doctrine.
Pushing the boundaries. Give me some examples. What kind of radical stuff did he come up with?
Well, he believed only God is truly incorporeal. Everything else has a physical form. Even the stars, he thought they were living beings.
Whoa. Okay, that's different.
And the sun, its eye dying according to him. And get this, he believed that even the devil would eventually be saved.
No eternal damnation. That's a pretty merciful view.
He saw God's mercy extending to everyone, even the fallen.
So a real universalist.
You could say that, but his views, they got him into trouble, of course. Condemned as a heretic.
Makes you think, what's orthodox anyway? Just the opinions of those in power. Big questions for another time. Let's focus now on 3 other heavy hitters: Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine.
These 3, 4th century AD, they really shaped the early church. Ambrose, he asserted the church's independence from secular authority.
So no kings telling the church what to do.
Exactly. Then Jerome, he gave us the Latin Vulgate and promoted monasticism.
Monasticism.
The whole monk thing, retreating from the world, prayer, contemplation.
Oh, okay. And Augustine.
He's the most influential. His theology dominated for centuries.
It's remarkable how their ideas survived, even with the Roman Empire falling apart around them.
Right. Maybe crisis breeds strong ideas. When the world's in chaos, people seek answers, new ways of thinking.
Makes sense. Let's talk Augustine specifically. The book mentions he was into Manichaeism early on.
Manichaeism. That was a dualistic religion, seeing the world as this battle between good and evil. Light versus darkness, cosmic tug of war.
Dramatic. Why was Augustine attracted to that?
He was wrestling with the problem of evil. If God is good, why so much suffering? Manichaeism had a simple answer: an independent evil force opposing God.
Makes sense. But he eventually rejects this, right?
He does. Neoplatonism influenced him there.
So what did Neoplatonism offer that Manichaeism didn't?
A more nuanced view of evil. Not a separate force, but a corruption of good. A turning away from God's will.
So it's not that there's this evil stuff out there, but good can be twisted, distorted.
Exactly. Like a beautiful painting, vandalized.
Ah, that's a helpful image. So not a cosmic dualism, but a moral fall from grace. Okay, now on to one of his most famous works, The City of God. What's the story behind that?
Rome gets sacked by the Goths, 410 AD, traumatic event. And lots of pagans, they blame Christianity. You're messing with the old gods, now we're getting punished.
Makes sense they'd be looking for someone to blame. So Augustine writes this to defend Christianity.
Yes, but it's more than that. It's this grand narrative of human history, past, present, future. He lays out these 2 cities, the earthly city, all human ambition, sin.
And the city of God.
Realm of the righteous. And they're in eternal conflict.
A cosmic battle playing out on Earth. Did he think these 2 cities could ever coexist peacefully?
Nope. He saw them as constantly struggling, mirroring the struggle within each individual soul.
So it's both a personal idea, political statement. The book says Augustine was influenced by Aristotle's view of God, but also differed in some key ways.
Right. Aristotle's God, distant, unmoved mover. Augustine's God is personal, involved, working for our salvation.
A God who cares.
Exactly. A God who intervenes, who offers hope, redemption.
Much more appealing emotionally, especially in times of trouble. But the book points out this paradox in Augustine's thought. He takes the Stoic idea of virtue being enough for happiness, B-U-T.
There's a Christian twist. For Stoics, virtue's its own reward no matter what happens to you. Augustine, he says, true virtue, it only comes through God's grace. We can't do it alone. We need help.
So more humble about human capacity.
Exactly. We need God to overcome our flaws. Ties into the idea of original sin too, right?
We're born messed up, basically. But despite this emphasis on God's grace, Augustine, he still sees conflict as central to human history, doesn't he?
He does. That battle between good and evil playing out on the world stage, but also within each of us.
Like a cosmic play, and we're all actors in it. Okay, Augustine's philosophical influences. The book highlights his love for Plato.
He saw Plato as the philosopher closest to Christian truth, God being immaterial, knowledge coming from beyond the senses.
Plato had some good ideas.
Augustine even dismisses the materialist epismos. Let Thales depart with his water. Kind of a burn.
He's got jokes. What about Aristotle? Did Augustine get anything from him?
Some, but less so. Respected his logic, his insights about nature, but thought he was too focused on earthly matters. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, he was the real bridge between ancient thought and Christianity, according to Augustine.
Passing the torch, generation to generation. Okay, let's talk about the Dark Ages now. The rise of the papacy. What role did the popes play?
As Rome falls apart, the papacy steps in, fills that power vacuum.
Interesting how a spiritual institution becomes a political player.
Right. And key figures, Gregory the Great, Pope Leo XII, they consolidated power, provided guidance, leadership.
But the book points out this paradox. The church, they claim spiritual authority, but they're not afraid to use worldly means.
Alliances, political maneuvering, even military campaigns sometimes.
Not exactly turning the other cheek. And the book mentions the donation of Constantine.
Ah, yes. That forged document supposedly giving the Pope temporal power over Rome.
Forged. So, a total fake.
Totally. But people believed it for centuries. Legitimized the papacy's worldly power.
A reminder that power can be built on lies, manipulation. Okay, let's talk about Charlemagne now. He tried to revive the Roman Empire, right?
Charlemagne, he was a force of nature. Ambitious, driven, saw himself as a new Constantine, defender of the faith, unifier of Christendom.
And he gets crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope Christmas Day, 800 AD. What a scene that must have been.
Symbolic moment. A new era dawning. It's this fusion of secular and religious power, mutually beneficial.
Church legitimizes his rule. He supports their authority.
But his empire, it didn't last, fragmented after his death.
Too bad. It was a good idea in theory.
It did set a precedent, though. That close relationship between church and rulers, it continues for centuries.
A delicate dance. What about monasteries? They were important in the medieval world, right?
Hugely. More than just religious communities, they were centers of learning, preserving texts, copying manuscripts, teaching.
Like little islands of knowledge, keeping the flame alive during those turbulent times.
Exactly. And they had economic power, too. Land ownership, often tax-exempt.
Ah, so they weren't just praying all day.
They were players in the medieval economy. And that sometimes led to conflict with secular rulers, competing for resources, influence.
So it wasn't all peace and quiet behind those monastery walls. The book talks about the investiture controversy as a prime example of this power struggle. What was that all about?
It was a fight over who appointed bishops, the Pope or the king. And bishops, they weren't just religious figures. They controlled land, wealth, had political clout.
So whoever controlled the bishops controlled a lot of power. Who won that fight?
It was a long struggle, full of drama. You probably heard about Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, standing barefoot in the snow, begging the Pope's forgiveness.
Oh yeah, that's a famous image.
Canossa, it's called. Ultimately, though, the papacy wins, asserts its supremacy.
So a victory for the church.
It was a turning point, but also laid the groundwork for future conflicts between the church and secular rulers. That tension never really goes away.
Power struggles, they're a constant throughout history.
Okay, let's talk about the rise of cities now. 11th, 12th centuries. Why was that such a big deal?
Cities, they were game changers, challenging the whole feudal system. They're centers of trade, commerce, attracting people from all over.
Melting pots of culture, ideas.
Exactly. And it's a new way of life. based on merit, opportunity, not just what family you were born into.
A more dynamic system, but also more disruptive, I imagine.
Definitely. Cities, they wanted self-governance, resisted both church and emperor, formed leagues, like the Lombard League in Italy, to defend their interests.
So they're flexing their muscles, not afraid to challenge the old powers.
They were a force to be reckoned with. And it's this rise of cities that paves the way for the Renaissance later on.
So it's all connected. But before we get to the Renaissance, let's talk about this Guelph and Ghibelline thing in Italy. Always fighting, right?
It was a nasty rivalry, rooted in that struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Guelphs, pro-pope, Ghibellines, pro-emperor.
And this tore Italy apart. For centuries, hindered unification, caused endless strife. Cities fighting each other, families divided.
Talk about a self-inflicted wound. Were there any attempts to bridge the gap?
Some rulers tried, but it was tough. You get caught in the middle. The book mentions Frederick II, this brilliant emperor who challenged the papacy. He even went on a crusade, but instead of fighting the Muslims, he negotiated with them.
Oh, talk about a bold move.
He got excommunicated for that, of course.
Yeah.
But he was also crowned king of Jerusalem, so.
Complicated guy. History rarely fits into neat boxes. Okay, now on to Thomas Aquinas. This guy tried to reconcile faith and reason, right? A tough job.
Aquinas, he was a Dominican friar and a brilliant philosopher. He wanted to bridge that gap between Aristotle and Christian dogma.
So prove that faith and reason can coexist. Did he pull it off?
His work was hugely influential, became the official philosophy of the Catholic Church, shaped Christian thought for centuries.
Wow. So what did he say? How do you reconcile those two things?
He argued that reason, guided by faith, can lead us to a deeper understanding of God's creation. He even saw beauty as a reflection of divine order, harmony.
Yeah. So the world is more than just a fallen place. It's a source of wonder, revelation. Did Aquinas follow Aristotle completely in his view of God?
He borrowed a lot, but made some distinctions. Aristotle's God, pure thought, right? Aquinas, he said, God understands the world he created. He's both transcendent and the immanent, beyond us, but also within us.
More personal, I guess. Fits better with Christian beliefs. What about the problem of evil? If God's all-powerful, all good, why so much suffering? How did Aquinas deal with that?
That's the big question, isn't it? He followed Augustine there. Evil is a privation of good, turning away from God's will.
But why would God allow that in the first place?
Aquinas said God allows evil for the sake of greater good.
Okay, that's a tough one to wrap your head around. Okay, back to the papacy. After that victory with the investiture controversy, doesn't the papacy start to decline?
In the 14th century, things get messy. The papacy gets uprooted from Rome, moved to Avignon, France.
The Pope in France? What happened?
Politics, pressure from the French monarchy, and internal church conflicts. The Pope's authority takes a hit. Looks like he's a pawn of earthly kings.
Not a good look for the church.
Nope. And then, when they try to come back to Rome,
More trouble.
the Great Schism. Two rival popes, each claiming to be the real deal.
Talk about a PR nightmare.
Chaos. Christendom's divided, kingdoms taking sides, families fighting over it.
How did they fix that mess?
Took decades. Eventually, a new pope everyone accepts. But the damage was done. The papacy's authority weakened, paved the way for the rise of national monarchies, and eventually, the Reformation.
Domino effect. One thing leads to another. Okay, before we leave the medieval world, the Knights Templar, what happened to those guys?
They were powerful, wealthy, famous for their role in the Crusades. But King Philip V of France, he accuses them of heresy.
Heresy, what were they accused of?
Denying Christ, spitting on the crucifix, secret rituals.
Sounds pretty serious.
It was all fabricated. Philip was in debt to the Templars, wanted their money. Pope Clement V, he was under Philip's thumb. So they cook up this trial, torture confessions out of them.
Brutal.
The Templars were destroyed, their wealth seized. A classic power grab disguised as religious zeal.
History's full of those stories. Okay, let's move on to a brighter chapter, the Renaissance. What made this period so special?
It was this explosion of creativity, rediscovery of classical learning, art, philosophy.
A rebirth.
Exactly. A celebration of human potential. Challenged the medieval worldview with its focus on the afterlife, all that.
A more human-centered approach.
Humanism. Celebrating reason, curiosity, the pursuit of knowledge.
Sounds inspiring.
It was. Think Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Galileo, Erasmus. These were polymaths, excelling in multiple fields.
Driven by that Renaissance spirit. But let's talk about Machiavelli now. He was a bit of a controversial figure, right?
Machiavelli, the ultimate pragmatist. His book, The Prince, it's a guide for rulers on how to get and keep power. Immorality, not so much a concern for him.
So the ends justify the means.
Pretty much. He said a ruler has to be willing to do whatever it takes. Lie, cheat, use violence.
His famous quote, "It is better to be feared than loved."
If you cannot be both.
Africa.
Exactly. He was skeptical of human nature, thought people are basically selfish, power-hungry.
So a ruler has to be ruthless to survive.
That was his view. Some see him as a cynic, others as a realist. But his work has resonated with powerful people throughout history.
Makes you think. Okay, let's move on to a more idealistic figure. Erasmus. He was a humanist scholar, right?
Erasmus, he was brilliant. Champion of learning, believed education could transform individuals and society, and he was a critic of the church, calling for reform.
So going back to the sources, the original spirit of Christianity.
Exactly. He even published a Greek edition of the New Testament, challenging the authority of the Vulgate, that Latin translation everyone was using.
Bold move.
He wanted people to read the scriptures for themselves, not just rely on the church's interpretation.
Power to the people.
And his work had a huge impact, helped pave the way for the Reformation.
It's amazing how one scholar can spark such a big change. Okay, enough religion for now. Let's talk science. We mentioned the shift away from the Earth-centered view, but it was Copernicus who really shook things up, right?
Copernicus, the sun at the center of the solar system. Can you imagine the guts it took to propose that?
Going against centuries of dogma, scientific A&D, religious.
He knew it would cause a stir. And, of course, there was resistance. People said it contradicted the Bible.
Which it did, on the surface at least.
It created this clash between science and religion, a tension that continues even today.
Big questions about how we know what we know.
Right. And aside from the religious objections, there were scientific ones too. People couldn't grasp how Earth could be moving without us feeling it.
We all know that feeling. You're on a train, throw a ball up, it comes back down to your hand.
Exactly. It's about frames of reference, relative motion. Copernicus, he argued, Earth's motion is so smooth we don't notice it, like sailing on a calm sea.
Makes sense. But his theory was eventually proven right, of course.
It was, and it changed everything. Ushered in the scientific revolution, this idea that we can challenge old authorities, build knowledge through observation, experimentation.
A new way of seeing the world. But Copernicus was just the beginning, right? Other astronomers built on his work.
Absolutely. Johannes Kepler, he makes some huge discoveries about how planets move.
Tell me more.
Well, first off, he figures out planets don't move in perfect circles. They move in ellipses.
Ellipses?
Imagine a stretched out circle, that's an ellipse. And this explained why planet speeds vary as they go around the sun.
It's like a cosmic puzzle and he's finding the missing pieces.
Exactly. And he made another big discovery, a planet's orbital period, the time it takes to go around the sun.
That depends on how far away it is.
Exactly. The farther away, the longer the orbit. These are Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and they gave us this mathematical framework for understanding the solar system.
Mapping out the heavens. But his work wasn't just about math, was it? It challenged some philosophical assumptions too, right?
Big time. Aristotle, he thought the heavens were perfect, unchanging, everything moving in perfect circles. Kepler shows nope, the universe is more complex, dynamic.
Another blow to those old, unquestioned authorities. Okay, let's talk Galileo now. He was the telescope guy, right?
Galileo.
Yeah.
He turned that telescope on the heavens, and it was a revelation. Can you imagine seeing those things for the first time?
Must have been mind-blowing. What did he see?
Mountains and craters on the moon. Not a smooth, perfect sphere like they thought. Spots on the sun, showing it changes too.
So even the sun isn't perfect. What else?
4 moons orbiting Jupiter.
More evidence against the Earth-centered view.
Exactly. But these discoveries, they got him into hot water with the church.
Ah, yes. Galileo and the Inquisition, not a happy story.
He supported Copernicus, and that was heresy. They put him on trial, made him recant his views.
The price of truth can be high.
But his work helped pave the way for modern science. And speaking of which, Francis Bacon, another key figure.
The scientific method guy.
That's him. Emphasized observation, experimentation, rejecting blind faith in ancient authorities. Learn from nature itself, he said, not just from books.
A true revolutionary. Did he have, like, a method, a set of steps for doing science?
He did. Observation, formulating hypotheses, testing them rigorously.
The scientific method in a nutshell.
Knowledge based on evidence, not speculation or tradition.
So, goodbye, Aristotle. Hello, modern science. Okay, now for one of the giants, René Descartes. Where do we even begin with this guy?
Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, famous for his method of doubt.
Doubt everything. Didn't he say, I think, therefore I am?
His most famous line. And it comes from this radical doubt. He questions everything, even his own senses, the existence of the world.
So how does he get from doubt to existence?
He realizes, even if I doubt everything else, one thing is certain, I'm doubting. And doubting is thinking, and thinking requires a thinker.
So the very act of doubting proves he exists.
Exactly. I think, therefore I am. The bedrock of his philosophy.
Pretty clever. But doesn't this focus on the mind lead to subjectivism? Like, if the mind's the only thing we can be sure of?
It does. Descartes shifts the focus of philosophy inward toward the subjective experience. And that sets the stage for all these debates about mind versus matter, perception versus reality.
Debates that are still raging today. But let's move on to Thomas Hobbes. He was a bit of a pessimist, wasn't he?
Hobbes. Oh, he was writing the shadow of the English Civil War, all that chaos, violence. It shaped his worldview, for sure.
So he was traumatized by what he saw?
You could say that. And his book, Leviathan, it's a defense of absolute monarchy.
Whoa, a strong king to keep everyone in line. Why did he think that was necessary?
He had this bleak view of human nature, thought we're fundamentally selfish, driven by a lust for power. Without a strong ruler, he said, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yikes. Not a very flattering picture of humanity.
He didn't necessarily see it as like good versus evil, more about survival. No strong leader, everyone's fighting for themselves, resources, power.
It's a dog-eat-dog world out there.
And he thought fear, that's the only thing that keeps us in check.
So not morality, but pragmatism. Do what you got to do to survive.
Right. You got to give up some freedom for security, order. That's the deal.
The social contract, huh? I wonder what Hobbes would think of modern democracy, all those individual rights.
Probably wouldn't be a fan. Too much potential for chaos, in his view.
Makes you think, right? Freedom versus security, it's an ongoing balancing act. But let's contrast that with John Locke, another big name in political thought.
Locke, he was more optimistic, believed we're born with natural rights, life, liberty, property.
Sounds familiar.
He was hugely influential on the American founding fathers, all that.
The foundation of modern democracy.
Exactly. He said the government's job is to protect those rights, not take them away. And if they don't, people have a right to overthrow them. Exactly. His ideas, they sparked revolutions, shaped constitutions all over the world.
Powerful stuff. Okay, before we get to all that, the book mentions Spinoza. Now this guy, he was a little out there, even for those times.
Spinoza, he was a pantheist, believed that God and nature are the same thing.
Whoa, so God's not separate from the world, but like, in it, everywhere.
Exactly. Everything's divine, in a way. But he was also a determinist.
Determinist, meaning everything's preordained, no free will.
He believed everything follows natural laws, even our thoughts, actions.
So what's the point of anything then, if it's all already decided?
Spinoza thought understanding those laws could lead to a different kind of freedom, freedom from our passions, desires. Not about choosing differently, but about accepting the flow of things.
It's an interesting idea. Not sure I buy it, but definitely thought-provoking. Okay, let's talk about the rise of modern science now. That had a huge impact on philosophy, right?
Huge. The scientific revolution, starting in the 16th century, it challenged so many assumptions about the world. Earth's not the center of the universe. Heavens aren't perfect and unchanging.
Knowledge itself was changing.
Exactly. And philosophy, it had to adapt. New schools of thought emerge, trying to reconcile these discoveries with those big questions. Reality, knowledge, ethics.
So what were some of the major responses? Did philosophy just throw up its hands and say, science wins?
Not quite. Two big schools were empiricism and rationalism.
Break it down for me. Empiricism, that's all about
Experience. John Locke, David Hume. They said all knowledge comes from our senses. We're born blank slates, and our experiences fill in the blanks.
So we learn by observing, experimenting, like science does.
Exactly. Rationalism, on the other hand, they emphasize reason.
So logic, deduction, figuring things out with our minds.
Descartes was a big proponent of that. Led to all sorts of debates about innate ideas, the limits of reason.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. Observation A and D reason, working together to understand the world. Okay, now for the Enlightenment. This was a pretty exciting time.
The Enlightenment, 18th century. It was all about reason, science, individual rights, progress. A very optimistic era.
Like, we can solve anything with our brains.
That was the spirit. And it led to real change. Think religious tolerance, separation of church and state, abolition of slavery.
Those are some big wins for humanity.
Right. Challenging the absolute power of kings, advocating for constitutions, individual rights, and education. big emphasis on education to empower people, promote progress.
The Enlightenment's legacy, it's still with us today. But let's talk about Immanuel Kant. He was a giant of the Enlightenment.
Right. He was trying to bridge that gap between empiricism and rationalism. Said our knowledge is shaped both by our experiences and our innate mental structures, what he called categories of understanding.
So it's not just passively absorbing information, we're actively shaping it.
Exactly. We bring something to the table, a way of making sense of the world that's already built into our minds.
So we're both products and producers of our own reality. Mind-blowing. Did Kant believe in God?
He did. But he said we can't know God directly through reason or experience. Faith for him was a matter of practical reason.
Practical reason.
It's necessary for morality, a guide for living a good life.
So faith and reason can work together even if they can't fully prove each other. Okay, let's move on to the Romantic movement now. This was a bit of a backlash against the Enlightenment, right?
The Romantics, they were all about emotion, intuition, imagination, celebrating the power of nature, the depths of human experience.
So less head, more heart.
You could say that. They often expressed this longing for something beyond the rational, the mundane, nostalgia for a simpler past, a connection with nature.
Those themes, they still resonate today, don't they? In a world that feels increasingly complex, technological. Okay, let's wrap up with the 19th century, a time of massive change, right?
The 19th century, it was a whirlwind. Industrial revolution, capitalism, empires expanding, so many opportunities, but also challenges.
Progress and upheaval all mixed together. What were some of the new philosophical responses to all this?
Well, one of the biggest was Karl Marx and his critique of capitalism.
Marx, the communist guy.
He argued capitalism is inherently exploitative, creates inequality. His ideas would have a huge impact on the 20th century.
Revolutions, political movements.
Exactly. And then there was utilitarianism, the idea that the best actions are those that create the most happiness for the most people.
Sounds pretty reasonable.
It was a philosophy of social reform, trying to make a more just, equitable world.
A precursor to modern social justice movements, maybe.
For sure. And then there's existentialism, grappling with freedom, responsibility, the search for meaning in a world that seems absurd.
A philosophy for an age of anxiety.
Exactly. The old certainties were crumbling and people were trying to figure out what it all meant.
So much change, so many new ideas. Oh, that was quite a journey. Over 2,000 years of Western philosophy, from those early Greek thinkers to the edge of the modern world.
It's amazing how these ideas, even from so long ago, they still resonate, still challenge us.
It shows the power of philosophy to make us think, to question, to seek deeper understanding.
It's a conversation that never really ends.
And that's what we've tried to do here. Have a conversation, explore these ideas, see how they connect to our lives today.
And hopefully inspire our listeners to keep exploring, keep questioning.
Because that's what philosophy is all about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners, keep those philosophical fires burning.